The bell at the gatehouse rang once, low and grudging, the way a servant rings when he hopes no one will hear. Edmund Ashcombe, 4th Duke of Halverford, heard it. He was still in the carriage, the curtain pulled back 2 fingers, and the road behind him already lost to the gray pre-dawn that wasn't quite light and wasn't quite mist. He had a few seconds to decide what face to wear when the door opened, and he chose the one he had worn for 9 years, which was no face at all. The carriage stopped. The footman did not jump down. That was the first thing wrong. A footman who has been waiting through the night for a duke jumps down before the wheels stop, because his hands have been ready on the latch for hours. This one stepped down slowly, as a man steps off a scaffold. Edmund noticed and said nothing. He had taught himself, over the long course of his marriage, that nothing said at dawn was ever recovered by noon. The door opened. The footman's eyes were red. Not from crying, from not sleeping, which was a different kind of wound. "Your Grace," the man said, and then could not find the second word. Edmund stepped down. He was 34 years old and dressed in last night's coat, which still carried the smoke of another house's fire and the perfume of a woman whose name he had begun, in the carriage, to wish he did not know. The drive was wet. The gravel hissed under his boots in a way gravel only hisses when no one has raked it. He looked up at the house. Halverford Hall in the half-light should have been gold over gray, the long windows showing the first lamps of the housemaids, the chimneys feathered with smoke from 100 grates lit before sunrise. There was one chimney smoking. Only one. The west wing, which contained the nursery, was dark. He noted that the way a man notes a stone in his shoe before he understands he is bleeding. "Where is Mrs. Carow?" he said. The footman swallowed. "Gone, Your Grace." Edmund did not move. The word "gone" is a word with a great many meanings in a house of 200 souls, and he waited, as he had been taught to wait, for the meaning to arrive on its own. The footman did not offer one. "Where is the steward, then?" "Mr. Brearley is in the library, Your Grace. He has been there since 2. Edmund handed his gloves to the footman, who took them as if they were hot. He walked past the man, up the 3 shallow steps into his own hall, and the silence struck him almost as a physical thing, because Halverford was never silent. Halverford had 200 people in it on the slowest day of the year, and at dawn, it should have rung like a struck bowl with the small noises of beginning, the clatter of grates, the soft argument of housemaids on a staircase, a kitchen door swinging on its hinge. There was none of that. There was the long clock in the hall ticking, and the sound of his own boots, and somewhere very far away, perhaps in the kitchens, perhaps only in his memory, the small sound of a kettle reaching the boil and being lifted off without ceremony. He crossed the hall. He did not call out. He had been raised by a mother who would not have called out in a burning house, on the principle that a duchess's voice should never be heard before the breakfast bell, and he had inherited the principle, if not the burning house. The library door stood half open. Brearley was at the desk. He was not writing. He had a candle, although the windows were beginning to gray, and he was holding a folded letter between his thumb and finger, as a man holds a wasp. He rose when Edmund entered, and the rising was slow, because he had been at the desk too long. "Your Grace," he said. Edmund closed the door. "Sit down, Brearley," he said. Brearley sat. Edmund did not. He stood at the window, his back to the room, his hands clasped behind him, and watched the line of the eastern sky lift one shade from iron to pewter. "The nursery," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "Where is my son?" He spoke the words evenly, the way a man names a card in a game he has already lost. And the steward, whose courage failed in many small matters, but had never yet failed in a large one, said, "He is not here, Your Grace." "Her Grace took the boy at midnight," Brearley said. "She left a letter." "She left two. One is for you. The other is addressed to the parish, and she instructed me to read it at noon, but I have not yet." "The estate, Your Grace." "The estate," Brearley said, and his voice did the small dry crack of a man stepping on a frozen puddle. "The estate has been sold." Edmund turned from the window then, but slowly, the way a man turns a heavy gun on a fixed mount, and his face when he turned was so perfectly empty that Brearley, who had served 3 dukes in this room, took an involuntary step back behind the desk, as if the desk could shield him from a stillness. "Sold," Edmund repeated. The word was not a question. It was a piece of stone he had picked up to weigh. The steward laid the folded letter down between them, very carefully, as one lays down a thing that may still bite. "The papers were drawn yesterday morning, Your Grace, while you were at Lord Aysgarth's. They were signed yesterday evening. They were lodged at Wexford Impel by 9:30. The purchaser took the keys at midnight from her own hand at the gate." Edmund did not pick up the letter. He looked at it as if it were a small animal he had not invited into the room. "From whose hand?" he said. "Her Grace's, Your Grace." Edmund nodded once. "To whom?" he said. "A Mr. Halloran, Your Grace, of Liverpool. A merchant. He has been in the county a week. He is at the bell at Halverford Cross. He has paid in full." Edmund considered the name Halloran. He turned it over. He did not know it. He had been a duke for 11 years and had believed, with the slow conviction of a man who has never been seriously contradicted, that a duke ought to know every name that could meaningfully bear on his land within 40 miles. And he had been wrong, evidently, by at least one. "By how much?" he said. Brearley did not pretend to misunderstand. £82,000, Your Grace. The whole of the entailed estate is unaffected, of course. Halverford itself stands. But the unentailed lands, the Welsh holdings, the Cumberland mines, the London properties on Half Moon Street and at Bedford Square, the plate, the library, the pictures in the Long Gallery, the carriages, the horses, with the exception of the 4 greys which were considered yours personally. The whole of the household plate, save the family christening cup. The home farm, with stock and implements. Edmund listened to the inventory the way a man listens to his own bones being named at a coroner's table. He did not interrupt. When Brearley reached the home farm, he stopped. "There is more, Your Grace, but the substance is there." Edmund crossed to the desk. He did not sit. He picked up the letter at last, with 2 fingers, and broke the seal. It was her seal, the small foxglove she had used since the year of their engagement, and the wax was so fresh it had not yet wholly hardened at the edges. He read standing. The letter was short. He had expected that. Clara had never used a long sentence when a short one would cut. "Edmund, by the time you read this, the boy and I are gone where you will not find us. Which is to say, not far, only out of your reach. I have taken nothing that was not mine to take. I have sold what could be sold. The price is in 3 accounts under names that are not yours, and the law will not undo any of it before the boy is grown, because I have made certain of that with men cleverer than the ones you keep. You will say I have ruined you. I have not. You ruined yourself and took 11 years to notice. I have only ruined the furniture. Do not come after us. Do not write. Do not send. If you behave, In 2 years, I will send you a portrait of him so that you may remember what he looked like at 6. If you do not behave, I will send you nothing, and you will spend the rest of your life remembering instead the smell of another woman's hair. Goodbye, Edmund. I did love you once. It is the worst thing I have to confess. Clara. Edmund read the letter through. He read it again. He folded it on the same creases she had folded it on, which was an old habit of his, and laid it back on the desk. He felt, with a clinical interest for grief, the way a man feels along his ribs for a break. He could not find it yet. He found only an enormous calm, like the calm one stands in at the center of a room that has just been emptied of all its furniture, where the carpet shows the bright squares of where the chairs used to be. The nursery, he said again. I have not been in. The nurse, Brearley. The nurse left with her grace, your grace. So did Mrs. Carrow. So did the 2 upper housemaids. So did Pell, the cook's boy, who was, I believe, sweet on the underservant Jenny, who also left. The kitchen is held by Mrs. Tovey alone, who will not abandon her ovens. The stables are held by the head groom, who would not leave the greys. Of the indoor staff, your grace, 11 remain, of 42. Edmund considered the number 11 of 42, and felt at last a small clean cut of something, very high up, near the throat. He nodded. Tell Mrs. Tovey, he said, that I will take coffee in the morning room in a quarter of an hour. Tell the head groom that the greys are not to be put to until I send word. Tell the rest of the household, what there is of it, to gather in the hall at 8. He paused. And Brearley. Yes, your grace. The letter to the parish. Burn it. The steward did not move. I cannot, your grace, he said. It is a copy. The original is already with the vicar. Edmund inclined his head, as one does when a clever opponent makes a move one had not foreseen. Of course, he said. Of course she did. He left the library. He went up the great staircase alone. The long carpet had been taken up in the night, and his boots rang on the bare oak, and the empty rectangles where the portraits had hung the night before showed in the wallpaper as faint, warmer shapes. The ghosts of his grandfathers gone to a Liverpool merchant by way of a clerk in Wexford and Pell. He passed his own bedchamber and did not look in. He went on, along the east corridor, past the morning room, past the small sitting room his mother had used and his wife had not, to the door at the end of the west wing. The door of the nursery stood ajar. He had not, in 11 years of marriage and 6 years of fatherhood, ever pushed that door open with his own hand. He had been carried past it, as a man is carried past every small room of his house, by the current of a duke's day, summoned in only to admire, only to approve, only to be told the child was thriving, was sleeping, was beginning his letters. He pushed it open now. The room was not empty in the obvious sense. It had been emptied with care. The cot was still there, stripped to the ticking. The little chair was still there, on which a nurse had sat through fevers he had not been told the names of. The rocking horse was still there, a dappled gray his own father had given the boy at 3, because gray horses were the Halverford fancy. The board books were still there, in a neat stack on the low shelf, none of them new. What was gone was the small things, the clothes, the brush, the wooden soldiers, a regiment at a time, the cup with the painted hair, the blue blanket the nurse had carried over her arm down to the garden every fine afternoon, that he had seen, once or twice, from the library window, and had taken to mean the boy was well. The blanket above all. He stood in the doorway and looked at the cot and felt, at last, the place where grief lived, which was not in his throat or his chest, but lower, behind the breastbone, a small clean hole the size of a thumb. He went in. He sat down on the little chair, because the little chair was the only thing in the room that had ever borne the weight of a person waiting for the boy. And he wanted, for one moment, to put his weight in the same place. The chair held him. He set his hands on his knees and looked at the cot, and tried to remember the last time he had stood beside it. He could not. He could remember the year. He could not remember the season. He could not remember whether the boy had been awake. He thought, with a precision that surprised him, that he had not held the child since the christening, except at the small annual photograph the Dowager insisted upon, and that even there the boy had been handed to him already arranged, as one is handed a sword for a portrait, and taken away again as soon as the shutter was free. He sat in the little chair for what he afterwards judged to be 3 minutes. He counted them, because he had begun in the last quarter of an hour to count things, as a man counts beads when he has lost the thread of a prayer. 3 minutes. Then he rose, and he closed the nursery door behind him, and he went down to the morning room, where Mrs. Tovey, who weighed 14 stone and had cooked in this house for 30 years, and would not have abandoned her ovens for the second coming, had set out coffee on a tray, with 1 cup and 1 plate and 1 slice of bread. He thanked her. He had never in his life thanked the cook. She received the thanks as one receives an unexpected coin in a sleeve, with a small, startled look she did not permit to develop into a smile, and went out. He drank the coffee. He did not eat the bread. At 8 o'clock he went down to the hall and found 11 people, standing in a row along the wall under the empty squares where the portraits had been. They had arranged themselves, as English servants always will, in order of precedence, so that he could read his household at a glance. And what he read was this: the steward, the cook, the head groom, the under-butler who had been promoted by absence, 2 footmen, a hall boy, a laundress, an old woman from the still-room whose name he was sorry to discover he did not know, the gardener, and a girl of perhaps 14 with red hands who he understood, after a moment, to be the kitchen maid. 11. He stood before them. He did not climb the half-step onto the landing. He stood on the same floor they stood on, which was a small thing and also not. And he spoke. "I am told," he said, "that her grace has gone, and that she has taken my son, and that she has sold the unentailed estate. I am told that some among you went with her. I am told that you, who are here, did not." He paused. The clock ticked. "I will not ask any of you why you stayed," he said. "I will only say that I know you did not stay for me." He looked at Mrs. Tovey. "You stayed for the ovens." He looked at the head groom. "You stayed for the Greys." He looked at the gardener. "You stayed for the Espaliers, which would die in a fortnight without you." He looked, last, at the girl of 14 with red hands. He did not know why she had stayed. He suspected, from the way she stood with her shoulder almost touching the laundress's shoulder, that she had stayed because the laundress was the only person in the world who had ever been kind to her. And the laundress had stayed because she was 63 and had nowhere else to go. He inclined his head to all of them at once. "Whatever the reason," he said, "I am in your debt. And a duke who acknowledges a debt to his household for the first time at the age of 34 is a poor enough thing. But he is at least an honest one, as of this morning." He paused again. The hall was very quiet. He thought, with a private dryness that surprised him, that he had never in his life made a speech to so few people, and had never in his life meant one so entirely. "The house," he said, "will not be closed. The fires will be lit, what fires we can manage. We will eat in the morning room, all of us, at the same hour until further notice, because there are not enough of us to justify the dining room, and I will not pretend otherwise. Brearley will continue the accounts. Mrs. Tovey will continue the kitchen. The Greys will be exercised. The espaliers will be watered. And I," he said, "will go this morning to the bell at Halverford Cross to meet a Mr. Halloran of Liverpool, and ask him what he intends to do with my grandfather's library." He bowed to them, very slightly, the bow of one man to a room full of others, not the inclination of a duke to his staff, and went out. Brearley followed him as far as the door. "Your Grace," the steward said low. He had been a steward for 40 years, and he had loved Edmund's father, and he had not always loved Edmund, and he had a thing he wished to say and did not know how. Edmund waited. "The boy," Brearley said at last, "Your Grace. He was a quiet child. He was well loved in the nursery. I think you should know." Edmund looked at him. He felt the small hole behind his breastbone widen by a fraction, the way a crack widens in a wall when one's back is turned. "Thank you, Brearley," he said. "I did not know." Then he went to call for his horse. He did not call for the carriage. He called for one of the Greys, the oldest, a mare called Wren whom his father had bred and his father had ridden the year he died, and he rode out himself at 9:30 along the avenue between the lime trees. Because it occurred to him, for the first time in his life, that a man who rides through his own land sees more of it than a man carried through it in a box. The avenue was changed. He could not at first name what was changed. He rode slowly. He looked at the limes. They were the same limes. He looked at the gravel. The gravel had not been raked, which he had noted at dawn. He looked at the verges. The verges had been mown a week ago and not since. He looked at the fences. The fences were sound. He rode on, past the lodge, where the lodge-keeper's wife stood in the door with a baby on her hip and did not curtsy, only watched him go by. And he understood her not curtsying as the first wage of his own neglect and accepted it. He rode through the village. The village did not look at him. That was not unusual. The village had never quite looked at him because he had never quite looked at the village. And a courtesy unreturned for 11 years had hardened, in the village, into a kind of polite blindness. The bell stood at the crossroads. Its sign had been repainted in the last year, which he noticed now and had not noticed before. He dismounted. He gave the reins to a boy who appeared from the yard and ran a hand down Wren's neck before he gave her up, because the mare had carried him well, and he was, at 34, beginning to learn that thanks are not diminished by being given to a horse. He went in. The tap room was empty at that hour. The landlord came out wiping his hands and stopped when he saw the Duke, and made the small adjustment of posture that English landlords make when an unexpected nobleman comes through the door. And Edmund said, "Mr. Halloran?" The landlord did not pretend to misunderstand. "He is in the back parlor, Your Grace. He is at his breakfast." Edmund nodded. "Tell him, please, that the Duke of Halverford requests the favor of joining him." The landlord went. He came back. "He says, Your Grace, that the Duke is welcome, but the bacon is his." Edmund permitted himself, for the first time that morning, a small involuntary movement at the corner of his mouth that was almost a smile. He went through. Mr. Halloran of Liverpool was a man of perhaps 50, square-built, grey at the temples, in a coat that had been cut by a London tailor not more than 3 months ago, and was therefore, Edmund judged, his first London coat. because a second London coat is always cut with less anxiety than a first. He did not rise. He gestured to the chair opposite. He had a plate of bacon, a plate of eggs, a pot of coffee, a small loaf, and, beside the loaf, a folded paper which Edmund recognized at a glance as a Wexford and Pell envelope. "Your Grace," Halloran said. Edmund sat. "Mr. Halloran," he said. There was a silence, not uncomfortable. The landlord brought a second cup. Halloran poured coffee into it without asking, which Edmund noted and approved, because a man who pours coffee for a duke without asking has either no sense of his station or a very clear one, and Halloran did not strike him as a man without sense. Halloran pushed the cup across. "You will want," he said, "to ask me a great many questions, Your Grace, and I will answer such as I can. But I will tell you at the start that I did not know your wife before last Tuesday week, and I have not the smallest interest in your domestic affairs. I bought the lands because they were for sale at a price that flattered me, and the price flattered me because she was in a hurry, and she was in a hurry, I gather, because of you. That is the whole of what I know of you, Your Grace, and I would prefer, if it is the same to you, to keep it so." Edmund considered the man. He took a sip of the coffee, which was better coffee than he had expected at the Bell, and he set the cup down. "Mr. Halloran," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "Tell me," he said, "what you intend to do with my grandfather's library." Halloran put down his knife. He looked at Edmund for a long moment, and Edmund had the impression of being weighed on a set of merchant's scales that had weighed a great many heavier things, and found himself, to his slight surprise, not entirely contemptible. "The library," Halloran said, "is a problem." Edmund waited. "I have," Halloran said, "no use for it. I cannot read Latin. My wife cannot read Latin. My sons, who will inherit, will, I hope, read Latin, but only enough to get themselves through Liverpool College, which does not require a library of 6,000 volumes. I could sell it, of course. There are men in London who would take it tomorrow." He paused. He took up his knife again and did not use it. "But," he said, "I have been in your gallery, Your Grace, and I have stood in your library, and I have stood in the long gallery where your grandfathers used to hang, and I have a notion, which I have not yet told my wife because she will laugh, that a man who has bought a great house should know what he has bought before he sells off the parts of it." He looked at Edmund. "So I will not sell the library this year," he said. "I will perhaps not sell it next year. I will perhaps, if I find a man among your former tenants who can read Latin and is willing to be paid in lodging and small money to keep the books from going to mold, leave the library where it is for as long as it amuses me to leave it there. That is what I intend to do with your grandfather's library, Your Grace. It is not, I am aware, what you came to hear." Edmund inclined his head. "It is not what I expected to hear," he said. "It is better." There was another silence. Halloran ate a piece of bacon. He chewed thoroughly. He swallowed. He said, "Your Grace, may I ask you a thing in return?" "You may." Halloran set down his fork. "The boy," he said. "Was he well treated?" Edmund did not at once answer. He looked at the window of the back parlor, which gave onto a yard in which a cat sat on a barrel, and watched a sparrow with the patient attention of a creature who had eaten that morning, and was, for the present, only studying the question. "I am told he was," he said. "I do not know it of my own knowledge. I was not, Mr. Halloran, a father in any sense you would recognize the word. I was a man who had a son." Halloran nodded. He did not look away. "Then I am sorry, Your Grace," he said. "For what it is worth from a stranger in a parlor. I am sorry." Edmund discovered, with the same clinical interest as before, that the small, clean hole behind his breastbone had widened again. He did not show it. "Thank you," he said. He stood. "Mr. Halloran." Halloran rose. "Your Grace?" "I will trespass on your property from time to time," Edmund said, "if you will permit it. To walk the boundary at the Welsh holdings, to stand once a quarter in the long gallery, to borrow, perhaps, the occasional book." Halloran extended his hand, which was the gesture of a merchant and not of a gentleman, and Edmund took it, which was the gesture of a duke who had decided, in the last hour, that the distinction was no longer one he could afford. "You will be welcome," Halloran said. "Bring your own horse. I have not yet bought yours." He rode back along the avenue under the limes, and somewhere between the third tree and the fourth, he understood, without making a sentence of it, that he had not been a duke for 11 years, so much as he had been worn by a duke for 11 years, the way a coat is worn by a man who has long ceased to notice the cut of it, and that the coat had been taken off him in the night by his wife, and that he was, for the first time since he had been the boy in the nursery he could no longer remember, walking in his own skin, in his own light. The skin was thinner than he had supposed. The light was kinder. He did not, that day, write to his lawyers. He did not, that day, write to his mother, who would have to be told and would have to be told carefully. He did not, that day, do any of the things a duke is expected to do when his house has been gutted in the night. He rode home. He gave Wren to the head groom. He thanked the head groom, who received the thanks with the same startled sleeve coin look as the cook had earlier, and went into the house. He went down to the kitchen, which he had not entered since the year he was 9, and he asked Mrs. Tovey what she would have him do until dinner. Mrs. Tovey, who in another age would have fainted and in this one only considered the question on its merits, told him that the apples in the still room wanted turning, and he turned them, slowly and methodically, for 40 minutes, and at the end of 40 minutes, the still room woman whose name he had been sorry not to know told him, without quite looking at him, that her name was Mrs. Penhale, and that her late husband had been a blacksmith at Halverford Cross, and that her son had emigrated to Canada the year of the bad winter, and that she had 3 letters from him which she could not read because her eyes were going, and that if his Grace would be so kind one evening, she would be obliged. He said he would be so kind. He read her the letters that night by the fire in the still room, with Mrs. Tovey listening from the kitchen doorway, and the kitchen maid with the red hands sitting very still on a stool. And the son in Canada turned out to be alive and married, and the father of a child of 2, and Mrs. Penhale, who had not cried in the morning when the house was gutted, cried then, quietly, into her apron. And Edmund, who had not cried either, found that his own eyes were not quite dry, and did not pretend they were. He went up to his bedchamber late. He did not sleep. He sat by the window, in the chair his father had sat in, and watched the moon come up over the home farm which was no longer his, and thought about his son. He thought about the boy in a way he had not permitted himself to think about anything in 11 years, which was without strategy, without calculation, without the small constant interior arithmetic of what is owed and by whom. He thought of the blue blanket. He thought of the dappled rocking horse. He thought of the painted cup with the hair on it, and tried to remember whether he had ever, in any year, given the boy a cup. He had not. He had given him a christening. He had given him a name. He had given him a portrait once a year in which the boy had been arranged in his arms like a sword. He had given him nothing else that the boy could carry away in a nurse's bag at midnight. He understood, sitting in his father's chair, that his wife had not stolen his son. He understood that he had never had his son to be stolen, and that what she had taken was the polite fiction that he had, and that she had taken it because she had loved the boy, and because she had loved Edmund once, and because love that has been disappointed for 11 years acquires, at the end, a clarity that looks from the outside very much like cruelty, and is not. He sat with this knowledge for a long time. He did not weep. He found that he could not. He had not been taught how, and the small, clean hole behind his breastbone had not yet widened far enough to admit it. But he sat with the knowledge. And at some point in the small hours he made, without quite making it, a decision. He would not chase her. He would not write. He would not send. He would do the only thing he had ever read in any book that struck him as worth doing in such a case, which was to become, slowly and without witnesses, a man whom, in 2 years' time, when she sent the portrait of the boy at 6, she would not be sorry to have once loved. It was, he thought, a very small ambition for a duke. It was, perhaps, the first real one he had ever had. He slept at last in the chair, and woke at dawn with a stiff neck and a clearer mind, and went down to breakfast in the morning room with the 11, because they had agreed to take their meals together, and because Mrs. Tovey, who had been a cook for 30 years, had decided that a household of 12 was a household that ate at one table, and a duke who disagreed with Mrs. Tovey on a matter of catering was a duke who would eat his eggs cold. He did not disagree. He ate his eggs hot. He passed the salt to the gardener, who took it without thanks, because the gardener was not a man who thanked anyone for salt. And Edmund found himself, again, almost smiling. The weeks went by, and then the months. He learned the names of the 11. He learned the names of the village. He learned that the lodgekeeper's wife was called Bridget, and that her baby was called Tom, and that Tom had been ill in the autumn with a croup the doctor had not been called for because the doctor had not been called to a lodgekeeper's child in the memory of any lodgekeeper. And Edmund called the doctor the next time and paid him out of his own pocket, and Bridget curtsied to him on the road thereafter, not with the polite blindness of before, but with the small, awkward warmth of a woman who has not yet decided how to be grateful and is practicing. He learned that the gardener was called Mr. Jellicoe, and that Mr. Jellicoe had a daughter who taught the village school, and that the village school had no Latin, and that Mr. Jellicoe's daughter, who was 23 and freckled and unmarried and entirely unimpressed by dukes, would like very much to learn Latin if there were anyone in the parish willing to teach her. Edmund taught her Latin. He taught her on Tuesday evenings in the library of Halverford, which was, by the terms of his agreement with Mr. Halloran, still his to use. And he taught her badly at first, and better as the months went on, and by the time the snow came in November, she could read a page of Caesar with only minor swearing, which was, Edmund thought, the proper response to Caesar from any woman of sense. Mr. Halloran came down to the country in the spring. He stayed at the Bell. He walked up to Halverford one afternoon, not by invitation, but by the easy gait of a man who has bought a house and means to look at it. And he found Edmund in the long gallery, dusting his grandfather's portraits with a soft cloth, because the Liverpool merchant's housekeeper had not yet been engaged, and the dust was beginning to settle. Halloran stood in the doorway and watched for a while. "Your Grace," he said at last. Edmund turned. He had a smudge on his cheek. "Mr. Halloran." Halloran came in. He looked at the portraits. He looked at Edmund. He said, "I have been thinking, Your Grace, about the library, and about the long gallery, and about the home farm, and about a great many other things." Edmund waited. Halloran said, "I am not a sentimental man. I am a Liverpool man. I have made my money in cotton and ships and small interests in railways, and I do not believe, on principle, in giving back what I have bought. But I have a wife who has been here twice now, and a daughter who has been here once, and they have between them informed me, in the courteous way of women who have already decided, that a house of this kind is not improved by being owned by a man who cannot read its books." Edmund laid down the cloth. "So," Halloran said, "I have a proposal. I will keep the Welsh holdings, which produce. I will keep the Cumberland mines, which produce more. I will keep the London properties, which are an investment. I will keep, because it would be ridiculous not to, the plate, the pictures, and the carriages. But the home farm, Your Grace, and the library, and the long gallery, and the right to call yourself master of them, I will sell back to you at the price I paid for them, over 20 years at 4%, on the security of your future rents from the entailed estate, on one condition. Edmund inclined his head. The condition, he said.
Halloran looked at him steadily. That when your son comes home, Your Grace, he said, you bring him to my house in Liverpool, and you let my daughter, who is 9, give him tea. Because she has heard from her mother, who has heard from the landlord's wife, who has heard from Mrs. Tovey, who is, I gather, a woman of large opinions and a longer reach, that there is a small boy somewhere, whose father has begun, late, to be worth knowing. And she would like, my daughter, to know him too. Edmund looked at the man for a long moment. He felt the small, clean hole behind his breastbone, which had been widening all year, fill at last, not with grief, but with something else, which he had no name for, and did not need one. Mr. Halloran, he said, Your Grace, I accept your terms. We will draw them up at Wexford and Pell. They shook hands again, in the long gallery, under the portrait of the second Duke, who had been a brawler and a poet and a great disappointment to his mother, and who looked down on the transaction with what Edmund chose to read as approval. The second year passed. The portrait came, as promised. It came in a small parcel, wrapped in brown paper, sent from an address in Yorkshire that Edmund did not recognize and did not pursue. He opened it in the morning room. The boy was 6. He had Clara's eyes and Edmund's mouth, and his own particular grave expression, which belonged to neither of them. There was a letter folded behind the portrait. It said only, "He is well. He asks about you sometimes. I tell him the truth, which is that you are learning. If you continue to learn, in another 2 years I will bring him myself to the Bell for an afternoon. Do not write back. Clara." Edmund propped the portrait on the mantel. He looked at it for a long time. He did not weep. He did, however, that evening, after Mrs. Penhale's letter reading and Miss Jellicoe's Latin and the supper of the 12, walk out into the home farm, which was once more his, and stand at the gate of the lower paddock where the greys were grazing, and say aloud, to no one but Wren, who came to the gate when he called, that he hoped, if the boy was permitted to come, the boy would like horses. Wren breathed warmly into his palm, which was as much answer as he had any right to expect, and he was, on the whole, content with it. And here, by the fire, we will leave him. If you have ever come home at dawn from a place you should not have been, and found a door open that you had never properly walked through, and stood in the doorway of a small empty room, and counted for the first time the years you had been carried past it, then you know already where Edmund Ashcombe ended that night, and where he began. Tell me, before you go, which moment stayed with you? Was it the unraked gravel at the gate? Or the little chair in the nursery that held his weight? Or the merchant in the back parlor who said he was sorry? Or the still-room woman crying into her apron at the news that her son in Canada was alive? Tell me by the fire. I will be sitting here a while yet. And if you would care to sit by this fire with me again, when the next story comes, you have only to draw your chair a little closer and stay. There will always be a place kept for you here, and another story laid by, the way one lays by a good log for the late hour, against the cold
and the dark, and the long quiet that comes before sleep. Until then, dear listener, rest easy and keep warm. And remember that the doors we have not yet walked through are still, for a little while longer, ours to open. Good night.